Any effective digital transformation requires a strong partnership between the organization that's implementing technology and the vendors that provide the technology. Unfortunately, it's somewhat of a battle in those sorts of situations, and it's a battle that you've got to win. And what I want to talk about today is how to win against the digital transformation industry. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. And finding the right vendors is a tricky proposition when you're going through a digital transformation. The whole industry is fraught with bias and risk. And when you're evaluating potential technologies or potential implementation partners, or even the right implementation approach, there's just tons of bias in the industry that can be misleading and can be distracting from what you need to make your digital transformation successful. So what I want to talk about today is how to create leverage within your organization so that you actually win this battle against the digital transformation industry. And it may sound as though I'm creating an adversarial situation, and to be clear, it does not necessarily need to be adversarial. But if you don't think of this as a battle and one that you need to take ownership and control of, you're going to lose the battle and you're going to get steamrolled along the way and end up with an end result that's not in your best interest. So what I want to talk about today are what are those things that you can do to be more effective, to more effectively manage the vendors and the different players in the industry rather than them managing you. One of the most important tools that are important in the battle against industry bias is going to be technology agnostic tools in the evaluation process. So as you're evaluating potential technologies, specific vendors, types of technologies, deployment models, whatever it may be early in the stages of your transformation, you want to make sure you're getting an unbiased view of what makes the most sense for your organization. Sounds simple enough, but software vendors and implementers, industry analysts, and even most consultants are biased, and they're going to have a one-size-fits-all answer that benefits them. So that can make it very difficult and tricky to navigate and understand and decipher between marketing and sales spin versus what's good for you. So when you're getting a demo from a vendor, for example, or when you're getting an RFP response or request for proposal response, generally vendors are going to position their products in a way that puts them in the most favorable light. That makes enough sense, and that's human nature. But for you as an organization, you've got to figure out how to decipher through that noise, cut through that spin, and understand the realities, including the dark side of what the risks are that maybe you're not hearing from the software vendors. So when you're evaluating potential solutions, you want to make sure that you're looking at not just RFP responses and demos and other sales and marketing collateral, but get objective sources of information, third parties that are completely independent and technology agnostic. And to be clear, I'm not talking about industry analysts, because industry analysts are also paid by software vendors. So if you're talking to Gartner or Forrester, if you're looking at Gartner's Magic Quadrants, those are commissioned largely by software vendors. So even there, you're getting sales and marketing spin. So you really want to go outside the realm of the normal software ecosystem and look to independent third parties. Organizations like Third Stage, for example, can provide independent data and advice and input into your decision process. One of the other actions of the software industry in general that creates imbalance between software vendors and their customers is the fact that they oftentimes require you or ask you to buy software licenses up front. And not only do they ask you to buy software licenses up front before you've even implemented the technology, they typically expect you to buy all the software licenses that you may ever need for that particular technology. And this is typically a big mistake, to go ahead and invest all this money in technology that you may not use for many years, depending on how long it takes you to deploy the technology. So one of the first steps after you've chosen the technology using technology agnostic inputs, now you need to figure out a way to acquire the software in a way that's not going to burden you financially, it's not going to benefit the software vendors at your expense, and it's going to create a more realistic and a more reasonable spend on technology that you're not using yet. So oftentimes what we'll advise clients to do, for example, is to underestimate the number of licenses they need, or to acquire the bare minimum number of modules that they may need, and work their way out from there. As you get into later phase of the project and you roll the technology out to more people and you start to add on more modules, then you acquire more software along the way. Now, software vendors certainly will give you a heavy or a steep discount to acquire more than you need upfront. That's up to you whether or not you think it's worth it. But what I'll tell you is, more often than not, we find that our clients that do fall for that sales gambit in buying more software than they need at a steep discount is they end up with a bunch of shelfware that they never use. And you have to ask yourself, is it worth the risk of never using the software in exchange for getting a good deal? Or am I 100% confident that I actually am going to use the software someday? And is the savings great enough to justify that? So that's just one example of a way that software acquisition process is imbalanced. And this is a way for you to create better balance and a scenario that's more aligned with your organization's best interests. Leverage and purchasing power within the software industry is a big problem. And what I mean by that is organizations that put all their eggs in one basket and go buy software and or services from one organization, they're putting too much money and they're concentrating their purchasing into too few vendors. What we find is that when you do that, oftentimes the vendor has leverage over you because now all of a sudden they own all the software that you're going to be deploying, or they're the ones providing all the consultants or all the service providers that are going to be helping with the implementation. And that may or may not be the best answer for you. So for example, we find that many of our clients benefit from distributing the spend across multiple vendors. So you're not focused on just one vendor, you've got multiple vendors providing services or products to you. Now, again, this has to make sense from an overall roadmap perspective. Certain vendors will give you discounts or try to incentivize you to not go look at other vendors and to put all your money with them, but you really have to make sure you're doing what's right for you as an organization. Now, this dynamic is especially true when it comes to system integrators or implementation partners. The general assumption is that when you go to implement any sort of technology, you need to hire one implementer that does all the work for you. And what I'll say is that that's a very risky proposition. You have to be very confident in that provider in order to justify that. But so many organizations go in assuming that they have to hire just one implementer. So even as you look to your implementation team, your implementation resources, think about how can I diversify the pool of resources I'm drawing from? How can I ensure that no one vendor has complete control over my implementation and ensure that you have control? And the way to have control is to, in some cases, diversify the types of resources you bring on to help with the transformation. Another powerful way of wresting control of these transformations away from vendors and bringing it in-house is just to simply build the internal competencies to understand the technology you're about to deploy, and more importantly, to understand how digital transformation should work, and as a result, making sure that your internal resources are heavily involved, and in many cases leading the charge and not deferring to outside third parties to lead the charge for you. So the more you can do this, the more you can rely on your internal team, the more you can rely on internal competencies and build those competencies, the less dependent you're going to be on third parties. And if you think about it, one of the primary ways that a system integrator can make a lot of money is if you don't know what you're doing. If you have no idea how to deploy technology, that actually works to their advantage because they're going to provide more resources. And guess what? You're not going to ask as many questions about why they're providing so many resources because you don't know any better. So the more you can educate yourself and take a leadership role and you be the one managing the vendor using your internal competencies, that's going to be a lot more powerful and a lot more effective than the organization that doesn't have the internal competencies and just defers to the outside providers. A clear strategy, plan, or roadmap to how you are going to deploy this technology, along with the people and process changes that go along with that, is probably the most powerful thing you can do to wrestle control away from outside third parties and maintain control of the transformation yourself. And the reason for that is because if you have a clear vision of what you want, you know what you want your future state processes to look like, you know how you want to phase the technologies, you know how you want to institute organizational changes and process improvements, the more you can provide a framework for the software vendor or the system integrator to implement within, versus having them come in with a blank slate, which oftentimes leads to an open checkbook for them to do whatever they think they need to do, and you won't know any better because you don't have any better of a plan. So even if you have an imperfect plan, even if you're not 100% confident in the plan you create or the roadmap you create, having one is a lot better than not, simply because it gives you control and it gives you a clear vision that others need to follow rather than deferring too much to those outside parties. So I hope this has provided some good insights as to how to maintain control of your transformation and how to ensure that you're regaining some of that power back from software vendors or outside third parties that tend to exert too much influence over these sorts of transformations. I also encourage you to download our annual digital transformation report, which I've included a link to below. That includes a number of additional best practices for how to make your transformation successful. And it's a great way to build those internal competencies and knowledge bases that you need to make your project successful so that you don't have to rely so much on outside consultants. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.